the wounded warrior. The arena floor was slick with blood and sand, a crimson mixture that told the story of a dozen fights before this one. Commander Zara Thix stood at the center of the fighting pit, her forearms flexing as she gripped her ceremonial blade. The weapon hummed with energy, its edge glowing with the blue fire that marked it as a weapon of the Cathari elite. Around them, thousands of alien spectators roared their approval from the tiered seating that rose like a metal mountain into the darkness above. Across from her, the human limped forward with a stubborn determination that both impressed and infuriated her. Captain James Morrison had been dragged into this arena 3 days ago, his military uniform torn and bloodied from his capture during the failed rescue mission on Kepler 442b. The humans had tried to save their colonists from Cathari expansion, and like so many before them, they had failed. Now this lone survivor stood before her, weaponless except for a crude metal rod he had somehow fashioned from debris. Morrison's left leg was clearly damaged, probably from the explosion that had killed his squad. Dark stains covered his torn pants, and she could see the way he favored his right side. His face was a map of bruises and cuts, his brown hair matted with dried blood. Yet his green eyes burned with something she had rarely seen in prisoners brought to this place: defiance. "You should have stayed in your little corner of space, human," Zara Thix called out, her voice carrying easily across the arena floor. The translation devices embedded in the walls ensured her words reached every being in attendance, from the insectoid Vlash in the lower tiers to the crystalline Nethys floating in their environmental bubbles, high above. "Your species reaches too far, too fast. Today, I demonstrate why the Cathari rule this galaxy." Morrison shifted his weight, testing his injured leg. When he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. "Funny thing about humans, Commander. We've never been real good at knowing when to quit." The crowd's roar intensified. The Cathari had made these gladiatorial displays a cornerstone of their empire, using them to demonstrate their superiority over conquered species. They broadcasted these fights across dozens of worlds, showing potential rebels what happened to those who opposed the four-armed warriors who had carved out the largest empire in known space. Zara Thix had fought in hundreds of these exhibitions. She had faced Vlash warriors with their razor mandibles, Gorvak berserkers who felt no pain, and even other Cathari in disputes of honor. In 30 years of combat, she had never lost a single fight. Her record was perfect, her reputation unmatched. The human before her would be just another entry in her victory record. She began to circle him, her forearms moving in the ritual patterns of Cathari combat. 2 hands held her primary blade while her secondary arms carried smaller weapons, a neural disruptor and a plasma caster. Her violet skin gleamed under the arena lights, the ceremonial scars that marked her victories standing out in sharp relief. She was a perfect specimen of her species, 7 feet tall, powerfully built, with the reflexes and combat training that had made the Cathari the galaxy's dominant military force. Morrison turned with her, keeping his makeshift weapon ready. The metal rod was perhaps 3 feet long, one end sharpened to a rough point. It was pathetic compared to her advanced weaponry, but he held it like he knew how to use it. "Tell me, human," she said as she moved, "what drives your species to such foolishness? Your ships are inferior, your weapons primitive, your military tactics predictable, yet you continue to resist us. Why?" "Maybe because we've seen what happens to species that don't resist," Morrison replied. His voice carried across the arena, and she noticed several aliens in the crowd lean forward to hear better. "The Yathari used to have 12 billion people on their homeworld. Now they've got labor camps and mass graves. The Zelon had a civilization that lasted 10,000 years. Your people turned their cities into rubble in 6 months." Zara Thix felt a flicker of irritation. The human was trying to turn this into a political demonstration, speaking to the crowd rather than focusing on the fight. Several species in the audience had grievances against the Cathari Empire, but they had learned to keep quiet about them. This human seemed determined to remind everyone of what resistance cost. "Those species were weak," she said, raising her voice to ensure the crowd heard her response. "They had forgotten how to fight, how to protect what they claimed to value. The strong rule, and the weak serve. This is the natural order." Natural order. Morrison laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Where I come from, we've got a saying, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Old Greek guy said that, couple thousand years ago. But you know what? We also learned that sometimes the weak get tired of suffering." He was stalling, she realized, trying to use words instead of weapons to achieve whatever goal he thought he could accomplish here. Perhaps he hoped to inspire some kind of rebellion in the crowd, or maybe he was simply trying to delay the inevitable. Either way, she had indulged him long enough. Zarathix moved with the fluid grace that made Cathari warriors legendary. Her primary blade swept in a high arc, designed to force him back, while her secondary arm fired the plasma caster at his feet. The energy bolt struck the arena floor and sent molten sand spraying upward, forcing Morrison to dodge sideways. The human's movement was clumsy, hampered by his injury. But he managed to avoid the worst of both attacks. His metal rod came up to deflect her blade, and the impact sent vibrations up both their arms. She was surprised by the strength of his defense. Most species would have had their improvised weapons shattered by contact with Cathari steel. She pressed her attack, using her forearms to maintain constant pressure. The blade work was intricate, a deadly dance that required her opponent to defend against multiple angles simultaneously. Her neural disruptor fired in short bursts, sending waves of disruption at his nervous system. Most beings would have collapsed after the first hit, their motor functions scrambled. Morrison stumbled, his left leg nearly giving out, but he kept fighting. Sweat poured down his face as he blocked and dodged, using his crude weapon with a skill that suggested military training. He was clearly outmatched, but he refused to give ground. The crowd was getting restless. They had come to see a quick demonstration of Cathari superiority, not a prolonged struggle. Some of the aliens in the lower tiers were making noises that she recognized as approval, not for her, but for the humans' stubborn resistance. "You fight well for a primitive," she admitted, pausing in her assault. "But this ends now." Her next combination was designed to finish him. The plasma caster fired at his chest while her blade swept low at his injured leg, forcing him to choose which attack to defend against. The neural disruptor charged for a maximum power burst that would shut down his nervous system entirely. Morrison made his choice. Instead of trying to block either attack, he threw himself forward, directly at her. The plasma bolt scorched past his shoulder, burning through his torn uniform. Her blade met flesh and bone, cutting deep into his already injured leg. Blood sprayed across the arena floor as he crashed into her, driving his makeshift spear toward her midsection. She managed to twist away from the worst of his attack, but the sharpened metal still scored across her ribs, drawing violet blood. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, and for a moment the arena fell silent. When they separated, Morrison was on one knee, his left leg now useless. Blood pooled beneath him, and his face was pale with shock and pain. Zarathix stood over him, her own wound superficial but her pride damaged. No opponent had ever managed to injure her in the arena before. "Yield!" she commanded, raising her blade for a finishing strike. "You have fought with honor. I will make your death quick." Morrison looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her hesitate. Not fear, not resignation, but a kind of fierce joy that she had never encountered before. When he smiled, blood stained his teeth. "You know what the difference is between your people and mine?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the silent arena. "When you're winning, you fight to stay on top. When we're losing, We fight like we've got nothing left to lose." Her blade struck his injured leg, driving deep into the wound she had already made. Morrison's body convulsed with pain, and she expected him to scream, to beg, to finally show the submission that every other opponent had eventually displayed. Instead, the human threw back his head and laughed in her face. The sound echoed through the arena like a challenge, like a declaration of war, like the howl of something wild and untamed that refused to be broken. The crowd erupted in confused noise, some cheering, others demanding an explanation for what they had witnessed. Zarathix stood frozen, her blade still buried in human flesh, staring down at an opponent who had just done something impossible. In 3 decades of combat, through hundreds of victories, she had never encountered anything like the sound coming from Morrison's throat. It was not the laughter of madness or desperation. It was the laughter of someone who had found exactly what he was looking for. For the first time in her life, Commander Zarathix began to understand why the human species was different from all the others her people had conquered. And for the first time in her life, she began to feel something that no HFY warrior should ever experience in the arena. She began to feel afraid. The defiant stand. The laughter died away slowly, leaving an odd ringing silence in the arena. Morrison's head fell forward, and for a moment Zarathix thought he had finally succumbed to his wounds. Then she saw the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way his hand still gripped his improvised weapon. He was gathering himself for something. "What are you?" she whispered, pulling her blade free from his leg. Purple and red blood mixed on the metal, alien and human life fluids combining in a pattern that somehow seemed prophetic. Morrison raised his head slowly, meeting her eyes. "I'm what you made us become," he said quietly. "Every colony you burned, every ship you destroyed, every family you scattered across the void. We remember all of it." Around them, the crowd had grown restless. This was not how these exhibitions were supposed to proceed. The alien spectators had come expecting a quick demonstration of HFY superiority, followed by the ritualistic consumption of exotic foods and the trading of political favors that made these events important social gatherings. Instead, they were watching something unprecedented, a defeated opponent who refused to acknowledge his defeat. High above in the royal viewing box, Supreme Commander Vothkai leaned forward with interest. The aging HFY military leader had built his reputation on understanding his enemies, and the human before him represented something new. In 50 years of conquest, he had seen every form of resistance the galaxy had to offer. Religious zealots who welcomed death, berserker species that fought until their last breath, hive minds that sacrificed individuals without hesitation. But this was different. "Send down the medbots," he ordered his aide. "I want that human kept alive." The aide, a young HFY officer with the purple markings of the intelligence corps, looked confused. "Sir, it is traditional for arena victories to end with—" "I know what is traditional," Vothkai cut him off. "I also know when I am seeing something unprecedented. That human has information I require." Below in the arena, Morrison was struggling to his feet. His injured leg could no longer support his weight, but he used his makeshift spear as a crutch, hauling himself upright through sheer willpower. Blood loss had left him pale and shaking, but his eyes remained focused on Zarathix. "You want to know about humans?" he asked, swaying slightly but remaining upright. "Let me tell you about my daughter, Sarah Morrison, 8 years old when your people hit Earth's outer colonies. She liked to draw pictures of spaceships, wanted to be an explorer when she grew up." Zarathix found herself listening despite her training. HFY warriors were taught to ignore the personal stories of their enemies, to see them only as obstacles to be removed. But something in Morrison's voice demanded attention. "Sarah was on Kepler 442b when you attacked," Morrison continued. The colony had been there for 15 years. Peaceful farming community. No military installations, no strategic value except as an example. You killed everyone to show the other colonies what resistance would cost them. The arena had grown quiet. Even the background noise of vendors and conversation in the upper tiers had faded as Morrison's words carried through the translation systems. Several species in the crowd had lost homeworlds to Cathari expansion, and his story resonated with painful familiarity. "I found her body 3 days later," Morrison said, his voice never wavering despite the pain that was clearly overwhelming him. 8 years old, dead because you needed to make a point about galactic politics. You know what I thought when I held her in my arms?" Zarathix realized she was holding her breath. Around her, the arena seemed to have become a different place, transformed from a venue of entertainment into something approaching a courtroom. "I thought about all the other fathers holding dead children," Morrison continued. "Yathari fathers, Zellan fathers, Gorvak fathers. Millions of them, scattered across dozens of worlds, all asking the same question. How do we make this stop?" He shifted his weight, wincing as his leg nearly gave out again. But when he looked up at her, his expression was not one of pain, but of grim satisfaction. "And you know what the answer was? We stop it by making sure that when you come for us, the cost is higher than you're willing to pay." The medical robots that Vothkai had ordered were descending from the arena's upper levels, their anti-grav units humming as they approached the fighting floor. Morrison glanced at them with what might have been amusement. "Too late for that, I think," he said, "but not too late for the rest." Zarathix followed his gaze and saw something that sent ice through her veins. Morrison was not looking at the medical robots. He was looking at a small device strapped to his wrist, a device that was now blinking with steady red light. "What is that?" she demanded, raising her weapons. "Dead man's switch," Morrison replied calmly. "Biometric scanner tied to my heartbeat and neural activity. When I die, it transmits a coded signal to every human ship in this system." The implications hit her like a physical blow. "You're lying. Our sensors would have detected any significant human fleet presence." Morrison's bloody smile widened. "Funny thing about humans, we're really good at hiding when we need to. And we've had 3 days to position ourselves while your people have been distracted by this little show." High above, Vothkai was receiving urgent reports from his sensor technicians. Long-range scanners were picking up massive energy signatures throughout the system, signatures that had somehow remained hidden until this moment. Human ships were decloaking near every major Cathari installation, emerging from asteroid fields and gas giant atmospheres where they had been lying in wait. "How many ships?" Vothkai demanded. "At least 200, sir," his aide reported, his voice tight with shock. "Including several we don't have classifications for. They appear to be surrounding the entire system." On the arena floor, Morrison was explaining the situation to Zarathix with the calm professionalism of a military briefer. "Earth's been preparing for this fight for 3 years," he said, "ever since Kepler 442b. We've been building ships, training crews, and developing new technologies specifically designed to kill Cathari warriors." He gestured weakly toward the device on his wrist. "This whole thing has been a setup from the beginning. The rescue mission, my capture, this arena fight. All of it designed to get your leadership in one place while we moved our fleet into position." Zarathix felt her world shifting beneath her feet. "You sacrificed yourself and your entire squad for this." "I volunteered," Morrison said simply. "We all did. Sarah's been dead for 3 years, Commander. My wife died in the same attack. The human fleet is all the family I have left, and they needed someone to hold your attention while they prepared to avenge everyone your people have murdered." The crowd was in chaos now. Alien species that had suffered under Cathari rule were cheering openly, while Cathari civilians were demanding explanations from their military leaders. The arena's communication systems were overwhelmed with incoming reports from across the system as human ships revealed themselves and began their coordinated attack. "This is impossible," Zarathix insisted. "No species has ever successfully challenged Cathari military supremacy. Your technology is inferior, your numbers insufficient." "Our technology was inferior," Morrison corrected her. "But we learn fast when we're motivated, and you gave us 3 years of motivation." On the massive display screens that ringed the arena, emergency broadcasts were beginning to show the scope of the human attack. Cathari defense platforms were erupting in massive explosions as human weapons tore through shields and armor that had previously been considered impenetrable. Ships that had ruled the galaxy for generations were being systematically dismantled by vessels of unfamiliar design. "The weapons you're seeing are built from the wreckage of every ship you've destroyed," Morrison explained, his voice growing weaker, but his satisfaction evident. "We studied every piece of debris, learned from every defeat. 3 years of reverse engineering your technology and improving it." Zarathix raised her blade again, but Morrison held up a hand to stop her. "You can kill me now if you want," he said, "but it won't change anything. The signal transmits automatically when my vital signs stop. And even if you could somehow prevent that, it won't matter. The attack is already beginning." She could see the truth of his words in the chaos around them. The arena's defensive systems were coming online, but they were designed to repel conventional attacks, not the coordinated assault of an entire human fleet. Energy readings were spiking across the system as battles erupted near every Cathari stronghold. "What do you want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Morrison's expression grew cold. "Justice," he said simply. "For every child your people have murdered, every world you've destroyed, every species you've enslaved. We want you to understand what it feels like to be on the losing side." The medical robots had finally reached the arena floor, but they hovered uncertainly as their programming struggled to analyze the unprecedented situation. Around them, the crowd was pressing toward the exits as emergency alarms began sounding throughout the structure. "Your empire ends today," Morrison continued, his voice carrying across the arena despite the growing noise. "Not because we're stronger than you, but because we learned something you never did." "What?" Zarathix demanded. Morrison looked up at her one last time, and in his eyes she saw the reflection of every world the Cathari had conquered, every species they had broken, every family they had destroyed in their march across the galaxy. "We learned how to die well," he said. "And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything." His hand moved toward the device on his wrist, and Zarathix knew that whatever happened next, the galaxy would never be the same. The price of victory. Morrison's finger hesitated over the activation switch. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the arena held its breath. Then, with a smile that held both sorrow and terrible purpose, he pressed the button. The device on his wrist pulsed once with brilliant light, transmitting a coded signal that raced through subspace at faster-than-light speeds. Within seconds, that signal reached human ships positioned throughout the Cathari home system, vessels that had been waiting in absolute silence for this moment. What followed was unlike any battle the galaxy had ever witnessed. The human fleet that emerged from hiding was not the ragtag collection of converted civilian vessels that the Cathari had expected. These were purpose-built warships, designed by engineers who had spent 3 years studying Cathari technology and finding its weaknesses. Each ship represented the combined industrial might of humanity's surviving colonies, working together with a unity that their species had never achieved before the Cathari attacks. Admiral Chen Wei, commanding the human fleet from the bridge of the newly commissioned UES Defiant, watched the tactical displays with grim satisfaction. The Cathari defense fleet was reacting exactly as human analysts had predicted, moving to defend their most obvious strategic targets while leaving gaps in their formation that could be exploited. All ships, execute Protocol Morrison, she ordered, her voice carrying across the communication channels to 200 human vessels. Remember why we're here. The response was immediate and devastating. Human ships that had seemed to be targeting military installations suddenly changed course, converging on the arena complex where their leaders knew Morrison was making his final stand. The Cathari had expected a conventional military engagement, but this was something far more personal. Inside the arena, Zarathix watched the display screens with growing horror as human ships carved through Cathari defenses with weapons that seemed impossibly advanced. Energy beams that penetrated their strongest shields, missiles that adapted to countermeasures in real time, fighter craft that moved with inhuman precision. "How?" she whispered, more to herself than to Morrison. The dying human heard her anyway. "Artificial intelligence," he said, his voice growing weaker as blood loss took its toll. "Something your people never developed because you thought organic intelligence was superior. We taught our computers to think like Cathari warriors. Then we taught them to think better." On the screens above, Cathari ships were dying in ways their crews had never imagined possible. Human weapons seemed to anticipate their movements, striking at precisely the moments when their defenses were weakest. It was as if the attacking fleet could read their minds. Every battle recording, every tactical manual, every piece of combat data your empire ever produced, Morrison continued. We fed it all to our AI systems. They learned your patterns, your strategies, your weaknesses. They know how Cathari commanders think because we taught them. Supreme Commander Vothkai was receiving reports from across the system, each one worse than the last. His fleet commanders were requesting orders, but every conventional tactic was failing against the human attack. Their adaptive weapons systems were overwhelming Cathari technology that had seemed invincible for centuries. "How many casualties?" he demanded. 40% of the defense fleet in the first 15 minutes, his aide reported, his voice hollow with shock. "Sir, we need to request reinforcements from the outer systems." "Reinforcements won't arrive for hours," Vothkai replied grimly. "And at this rate, the battle will be over in minutes." He turned his attention back to the arena floor, where Morrison was slowly bleeding to death, while still managing to provide commentary on humanity's first major offensive against the Cathari Empire. The human sacrifice was serving a dual purpose: military distraction and propaganda victory. Every alien species in the arena was witnessing the moment when the Cathari learned they were not invincible. "Tell me, human," Vothkai spoke through the arena's communication system, his voice echoing across the fighting floor. "What happens after today? Your fleet may win this battle, but we control hundreds of systems. This war will last decades." Morrison looked up toward the royal viewing box with eyes that were growing dim but remained focused. "You're thinking like a conqueror," he said. "We're not here to build an empire. We're here to end yours." The implications of those words sank in as more reports arrived from across the galaxy. Human ships were emerging from hyperspace near Cathari installations on dozens of worlds simultaneously. This was not a single-system attack, but a coordinated galaxy-wide uprising, timed to begin at the moment Morrison activated his signal. "Every species you've conquered has been secretly building ships," Morrison explained, his voice barely audible now. "Yathari engineers, Zellan scientists, Gorvak warriors, even some of your own people who got tired of living in fear. We've been coordinating with all of them, sharing technology, planning together." Zarathix felt something break inside her as she realized the scope of what was happening. This was not just a human attack, but a coalition of every species that had suffered under Cathari rule. Her people had created their own enemies through generations of oppression. "The galaxy is rejecting you," Morrison continued. "Every act of brutality, every demonstration of power, every world you destroyed to make a point, all of it created more resistance, more determination to see you stopped." On the screens, the tide of battle was becoming clear. The Cathari defense fleet was collapsing under the coordinated assault of technologies they had never encountered before. Ships that had ruled the galaxy were being systematically dismantled by weapons designed specifically to kill them. But it was not just the military defeat that was devastating. Every alien species in the arena was cheering openly now, their fear of Cathari retaliation overcome by the joy of seeing their oppressors finally face justice. Centuries of accumulated grievance were erupting into celebration as the impossible became real. "Your empire dies today," Morrison said, his voice now barely a whisper. "Not because we're stronger, but because we convinced everyone else to stop being afraid." Zarathix knelt beside him, her weapons forgotten. "What about mercy?" she asked. "When this is over, what happens to my people?" Morrison's eyes found hers one last time. "That depends," he said slowly. "Are you going to teach your children to be warriors or teachers?" Before she could answer, the arena complex shook as the first human ship opened fire on the structure itself, not to destroy it, but to extract their hero and complete the symbolic victory his sacrifice had made possible. Emergency force fields activated as the arena's roof retracted, revealing the human fleet in orbital formation above. A single ship descended through the opening, its hull scarred from battle, but its purpose clear. As it touched down on the arena floor, Morrison's eyes closed for the final time, but the smile remained on his face. The human extraction team that emerged from the ship moved with military precision, but their first priority was not tactical advantage. They knelt beside Morrison's body with a reverence that spoke of deep respect and profound loss. This man had volunteered for certain death to make this victory possible. Zarathix stood watching as they prepared his body for transport, understanding finally what made humans different from every other species in the galaxy. They fought not just for territory or resources or glory, but for the memory of their dead and the hope of their children. "Commander," one of the human soldiers addressed her directly. "Admiral Chen sends her compliments and a message." "What message?" she asked. "The war is over," the soldier said simply. "Your fleets are destroyed, your leadership is captured, and your worlds are surrounded. But the killing stops now if your people choose to surrender." Around them, the arena had become a symbol of transformation. Where once the Cathari had demonstrated their dominance, now other species celebrated their liberation. The galaxy was changing, and Morrison's laughter in the face of death had been the sound of that change beginning. As the human ship lifted off with Morrison's body, carrying him home to join his daughter among the stars, Zarathix realized she had a choice to make. She could continue fighting a war that was already lost, or she could help her people learn to live in a galaxy where strength was no longer the only currency that mattered. Looking up at the human fleet arrayed above her, she made her decision. The age of Cathari dominance was over, ended not by superior firepower, but by superior courage. Morrison had been right about one thing. Sometimes learning how to die well was all it took to change everything. The laughter of a dying human had echoed across the galaxy, and in its wake a new age was beginning. It was